Welcome to AFrame Lesson 3.5 Supplemental. In this video, we're going to extend what we learned in 3.5 to include how we can detect collisions between us and many objects on the screen. So let's get to it. All right, so just to orient you to what we have here, we have an array of cones that are flying off on their own. So what we would like to do, let me run it again, is that when we collide with a particular cone, that's when it launches. So the first thing we have to do is we have to stop the launching of the cones. So if we go to the cone class and go to the animation, we have to add something here. Now you might recall from an earlier lesson when we started exploring event listeners, we would use an if statement in conjunction with some flag to kind of prevent the animation from happening. So let's add that real quick. Let's run it. And let's just make sure that they're not firing. So the if statement's working. Again, the cone is waiting for this flag of fire to be set to true in order for it to actually launch. All right, so now let's go back to our main program. So, we have our for loop that populated an array called cones with just a bunch of cones. And in our recursive loop for the animation, we have another for loop that goes through each cone that's inside the array of cones. And we simply call the launch function for the cone. Now, right now, they're not launching because we're waiting for that variable, that flag of fire, to be set to true. So here's where we can use what we learned in 3.5 of the distance formula to calculate if we got close enough to a particular cone in order for it to fire. So let's do that. So if distance between camera and one of the cones. So again, you can't check the distance between the camera and the array. Just doesn't make any sense. But what you can check is the distance between the camera and each cone that's in the array. So by putting this if statement in the for loop, that's essentially what you're doing. You're still comparing the distance between two objects, but because it's in the for loop, you will check the distance between the camera and each of the cones that are in the array. Now, before I enter the next part, because you might be tempted to simply put cone here. And you got to add some threshold. Let's say a threshold of 1. The issue we're going to have here is that cone refers to the class, the whole class, the whole object. But when you look at our distance formula, we need to have access to something that has an object 3D attribute. Now, the only things that have this are actually A-frame components. So for instance, the camera, it's good to go because the camera is an A-frame component that was hard-coded in the HTML. The cone, though, let's ask ourselves, where is the A-frame component in the cone? Well, the A-frame component in the cone is in the variable object. Now, again, you probably haven't done this in any previous lesson or even discovery on your own, but what we will do is we will actually type in cone.object to gain access to that object variable in the class that represents the A-frame component. By doing this, this object now does have the object 3D attribute for it. Now, to kind of use that same logic, we're doing this distance formula in order to determine if a particular cone should fire. So going back to the cone class, we see here that we have a flag called fire. Now, because we're inside the class, we use the word this.fire. And when we had the event listeners, it was okay for us to set this.fire equal to true in the event listener. But because we're in the main program, we can't write this.fire. But what we can write is cone. That cone that's coming out here, we could set its fire variable to true. And let's take a look at that. Oops. Hopefully my changes took. And let's run it again just one more time just to make sure. All right, so I'm going to try to get close to one. And there you go. So notice only that particular cone is launched because that's the only cone we collided with. Now let's go to another one. And honestly, at this point, I could kind of just like go around the whole world and launch as many as I can in one shot. So notice these 6 I collided with. These 3 that are still here, I must not have gotten close enough for us to collide, hence setting that fire variable of that particular cone to true. Let's take care of that. So let's fire this one. Let's fire this one. And let's fire up the last one. And that's it. If we look up at the world, they should all be traveling up to the sky. All right, so let's go back to our presentation and let's review what we've done. So in this video, we extended what we learned in lesson 3.5 of calculating the distance between 2 objects to include the idea that we could do the same thing with an array of objects. The only thing we had to do was just use a for loop to go through each object that's in that array, and then simply use that same logic like we did in lesson 3.5 of calculating the distance between us and that particular object. Now, again, in this video, we compared ourselves against the objects, but again, you can compare another object to an array of objects. You can compare one array of objects to another array of objects. Again, the list can go on, and honestly, I could do another supplemental just to cover those scenarios as well. But hopefully you're excited about being able to check how you can collide, or an object can collide with many objects. Enjoy.